For those of you familiar with Japanese folklore, you will know that there were far more than just ghosts and oni in their myths and legends. There were all kinds of creatures and entities that roamed about the land, sometimes causing harm, sometimes being a nuisance, and sometimes being either completely harmless or even good. This video is all about that last category. Two stories about a very mysterious kind of creature that is only understood vaguely in Japanese folklore that I had actually never heard of before reading these stories. And I can't actually concretely define what these creatures are or what they do. So, if you like ancient Japanese folklore and literature, or Japanese history and culture, or if you just like storytelling, scary stories in particular, because we are in the section dealing specifically with ghosts and demons and spirits, please don't forget to like the video, please subscribe to the channel, because I do try to put out at least one new Tales video every week, and then some. And with all of that out of the way, let's get into the story. Once upon a time, ima wa mukashi. The retired Emperor Yose lived on a plot of land 2 cho in size, a cho being just under a hectare, or roughly 2.5 acres, just so we can keep the measurements straight. This plot of land was north of 2nd Avenue, Nijo, and west of West Toin Street, south of Mikado Street, and east of Abura Lane, so somewhere around this part of the city. But not long after the retired emperor passed away, the property was refurbished, with the northern cho being turned into several smaller residences for people to live in, while in the southern half of the property, the once beautifully kept pond was mostly left alone and neglected. The water weeds growing tall and thick, and all sorts of animals and other creatures taking up residence in its watery boundaries. Now, there is a consistent theme in Japanese folklore that non-human entities like to make abandoned human construction projects their home, and from what happens next in the story, it's clear that this was true for ponds as well. And so, time passed, with people in the northern part of this land moving in, settling, and living their lives, while the pond was left to nature and became more and more wild as time went on. But one summer night, there was a man who was living in one of these houses to the north, his home being one of those closest to the pond. It was a gorgeous night with the night bugs and the frogs of the nearby pond singing pleasantly, the breeze rustling through the grass and the leaves in the trees, and the stars shining so brightly that you could actually see surprisingly well. It being such a nice night, this man felt it would be a complete waste to try and sleep indoors like usual, and instead set up his bedding on the veranda of the house to blissfully fall asleep, enjoying all of the pleasantries that such a gorgeous night like the one he was currently experiencing had to offer. Needless to say, he fell asleep rather quickly, and was lost in some of the nicest rest anyone could ever ask for. But in the midst of what were undeniably some very pleasant dreams, something woke him up. After he returned to consciousness, but before he had opened his eyes, he heard something moving. Not inside the house like one would expect, but just the opposite. Something moving around just off the veranda in the garden area. This was unusual to say the least. Who the heck would be wandering around the garden at this hour? Was it someone with bad intentions? A thief or something? Or maybe just somebody playing a prank? Regardless, it was enough to scare this man a bit, who didn't want to draw attention to himself. So without shifting positions or making any sudden movements, he very slowly opened his eyes just enough to see through the starlight, and possibly a candle or two behind him. But he saw a sight that completely shocked him. He saw what looked like an old man with a wrinkled face and a pure white beard, very casually hobbling his way over to him. Seeing a random old man wandering about outside was already strange enough, but the thing that most surprised the now not sleeping man was that instead of being around the average height of a little over 5 feet tall, this old man was no more than 3 feet tall. An impossibly small old man, wandering around in the dead of night, a thing that old men never actually did, mind you, was almost certainly not an old man, but something completely different. Something that most people had only ever heard about in stories and legends. And whatever it was clearly making its way over to him. The man was terrified. This clearly wasn't human. But what was it? Was it evil? Was it angry? Why was it heading straight toward him? He couldn't be sure, but he figured the best course of action was to feign sleep and not do anything to antagonize this thing. And so the man reshut his eyes and lay there waiting, trying his best to keep his racing heart from giving away that he was actually awake. Soon, the old mini-man had closed the gap and stopped in front of the fake sleeping man. A short moment passed with nothing happening, and then a shadow fell across the man's eyelids, and he felt something cold touch his face. Several things, long and slender and round, poking at various parts of his forehead and cheeks. They were fingers, human-like fingers, but without the warmth that typically comes with human flesh. They were very gentle, prodding his face, almost like they were searching, trying to figure out what he was. It took everything this man had to keep from scrambling away as fast as he could and to keep his breathing controlled and steady. But after a long and tense moment, he felt the fingers lift off of his face and the shadow across his eyelids passed. Curious, the man opened his eyes ever so slightly, just in time to see this mini-man very casually take a few paces back, turn around, and head for the pond. Now with its back to him, the man opened his eyes fully and watched as this creature strolled up to the edge of the pond, took a step or two in the water, and then suddenly just disappeared. The man had to do a double take. Where did it go? Did it jump behind the overgrown vegetation? There was a lot of that, sure, but he didn't see it jump behind something. It just kinda disappeared. Was the dim starlight playing off the water making him see things? And what even was that, and why did it wander up to him and study his face? He had no answers. He could only lay there, towing the line between wonder and panic, completely confused as to what to do. But that wasn't the end of this old mini-man's visits. The same thing happened over the course of the next several nights, with this thing wandering up to the veranda of the house, studying the man's face, and then disappearing into the pond. Naturally, the man started telling the people around him what he was experiencing, as most people at the time had no trouble believing that weird things happened in the deepest hours of the night, and that unusual things might take up residence in an abandoned pond. Now, most everyone who heard this man's story about how he thought there was something living in the very same abandoned pond found the whole thing to be terrifying. Even if this thing wasn't causing any immediate harm, who knew if it would continue to be harmless? Or maybe it was some kind of an omen. Omens usually weren't good. But while most everyone was more than willing to just keep their noses out of it, there was one man who heard this story, a warrior type, who responded that he wanted to find out what this thing was, and promised the first man that he would catch it so they could have a good look at it and maybe figure out how to keep it from harassing people in the dead of night in the future. Now again, not everyone was fond of this idea of antagonizing this thing. But if this warrior guy wanted to put his own neck on the line to do something about the house's strange nightly visitor, well, no one was going to stop him. And so the next night, this warrior guy, instead of preparing weapons, after all this thing had not actually caused any harm to anybody, instead got a single sturdy rope, and bringing it to the first man's house, he set it off to the side while he laid down on the very same veranda and pretended to be asleep, just as the first man had done many times before. He was completely alone in this instance, however. No one else wanted to be around in case things turned ugly, including the first man. But this warrior guy, while not a complete hothead, wasn't one to be swayed by stories of a tiny old man in the dark, and so he waited. Darkness fell completely. No sign of the mini-man. He waited more. Nothing. More waiting. Not a whisper. At this point, the warrior was getting a little annoyed. But more than that, he was also starting to genuinely nod off. One can only keep sleep at bay for so long when you're actively laying in bed with your eyes closed and all of the glories of a nice summer night are seemingly doing their best to lull you into a peaceful rest. And so midnight came and went, with this warrior now fighting desperately just to keep from completely falling asleep, drifting in and out of consciousness. In the midst of an episode where his mind was barely aware of anything going on around him, he suddenly felt something cold touch his face. The sensation woke him up completely, and instantly he knew that the old mini-man had finally showed up. For a moment, though, he merely laid there, with his eyes shut, attempting to lure his prey into a false sense of security. And then, in an instant, with the deftness and confidence that only somebody very experienced in hand-to-hand combat could muster, this warrior, in one swift motion, sprang up, grabbed the rope by his side with one hand, and whatever was touching him with the other, subdued this thing, and then quickly tied it up. After taking a step back to look at his catch, sure enough, it was indeed an impossibly tiny old man, just like the one that the first guy had described. Wrinkled face, long white beard, the whole 9 yards. The warrior then set the mini-man on the veranda and called out to everybody in the house. It wasn't long before practically everyone who lived there and even some of the neighbors had arrived carrying an assortment of torches, by the light of which they were able to get a good look at this warrior's catch. It did indeed look like a small old man, no taller than 3 feet and sporting a pale green outer kimono and hakama pants. Of course, everyone seeing this thing for themselves was absolutely astonished. But what further surprised them was just how pitiful the mini-man looked. Instead of glaring at them with supernatural eyes or cursing them in some magic tongue, it just kinda sat there, looking almost like it was going to keel over, absent-mindedly staring at the floor and blinking repeatedly. It was actually kind of depressing. Several of the people tried talking to it, asking it various questions, but it ignored them, looking like it was, again, completely out of it. After a short while with everyone discussing among themselves what they should do next, the mini-man suddenly stirred and smiled a slightly crooked smile and cast his eyes about him. It then asked in a hoarse, very weak-sounding voice, "Could you fill a tub with water and bring it to me?" Sorry, that's my hoarse old man voice impression. The onlookers weren't exactly sure what to make of this either. What a weird thing to request and out of nowhere. But curious to see how things played out, they figured, why not? And so, a couple of them found a big wash basin, filled it around halfway full of water, and then hauled it back to the group and set it in front of the mini-man. Once the water had been set in front of him, the old mini-man extended his neck to get a better look at the surface, and after gazing at it for a bit and the sloshing of the water stopped, he broke into an even wider smile and said, "You know, I'm actually a Mizuno Tama." It then fell forward into the tub with a splash and disappeared. The second it did so, though, the tub filled completely with water and a massive amount of it spilled over the brim and onto the floor. The rope that had tied the mini-man floated impotently to the surface, still tied in a knot. Of course, everyone seeing this couldn't believe their eyes. They just watched a small man turn into water and disappear. Even though everyone had heard these kinds of stories before, actually seeing it for themselves was another matter entirely. Clearly, this mini-man was indeed something supernatural, and while everyone was at least a little freaked out, it had not only been subdued easily, but hadn't actually caused anyone any harm, and so, coming to a collective agreement, the people of the house carefully carried this tub of water to the pond, making sure not to spill any on the way, and dumped it in to put the little mini-man of the pond back where he belonged. And since that day, no one has seen him show up to poke and prod people in the face at night. And thus is it said that this was indeed a water sprite, a Mizuno Tama, that had taken on the form of a human. But when it comes to sprites or spirits, there are more than just water ones, as in this next story. I couldn't begin to tell you what exactly these creatures are, what they do, or what other kinds of tama, or spirits, there are in the many pages of ancient Japanese legend. Again, I had never actually heard of this kind of creature in Japanese myth and folklore until I came across these stories specifically. But maybe between the previous story and this next one, which I'll say is very short and lacking in detail, you can at least get an idea, at least a little bit, of what these things are. Once upon a time, ima wa mukashi. In the residence known as Higashi Sanjo, there lived a man known as the Shikibukyo no Miya. I'm not going to translate that term, you're just going to have to look it up. My sources tell me that this man is more commonly known to us today as Prince Shige Akira, the fourth son of Emperor Daigo. Now this residence that he lived in, like many of the residents of the very wealthy at the time, had several man-made features on the property that resembled natural counterparts. In Prince Shige Akira's residence, there was a hill to the south that added a very nice aesthetic touch to the garden. But the prince and the members of his house would occasionally see something very odd around that hill. A small, very plump man with a height no greater than 3 feet and sporting clothes of someone in the 5th rank would wander around the base of that hill, casually meandering with no clearly apparent goal. Everyone was quick to surmise that this mini-man was actually something non-human. The first time it was sighted, everyone hoped that if they ignored it, it would just go away. But after a second, third, fourth, and many other times, it was clear that this thing had no intention of leaving. This unnerved the people of the house and Prince Shige Akira so much that the prince called on a very well-renowned onmyoji, basically an ancient Japanese wizard, and had him investigate the situation. After doing whatever it is that onmyoji do to determine and identify the nature of supernatural phenomenon in the area, he returned to the prince and reported that this was a mononoke, a Japanese word that's a little hard to translate, but you can think of mononoke as something like a ghost, though the vast majority of mononoke are actually malicious and dangerous. But this onmyoji assured the prince that this one was not the kind that caused harm to humans. The prince was indeed relieved at this news, but had even more questions. He asked this onmyoji, "Do you know what its source is? And do you know what kind of spirit it is?" The onmyoji replied, "It's the spirit of some kind of bronze implement, your highness, and I believe the item it stems from is buried somewhere in the southeast part of your property." The prince then gathered some help together, gave everyone shovels, and with the onmyoji on site to actively give directions, set about digging up a specific spot in the garden close to the hill. They dug for about 3 to 4 feet into the ground and, finding nothing, only for the onmyoji to perform another rite of location, and told them to keep digging, and that the thing they were looking for was not far at all. After another 6 inches of digging or so, they partly hit something hard that was clearly not a rock. They then dug around this thing, and then wiping away the dirt, they were surprised to find a copper hisage, a kettle-like object with an open top. What they then did with this hisage, the story doesn't say. But since that day, the little 5th rank man, the little mononoke, was never seen wandering around the garden again. And then the story does something very interesting here. It declares that the mini-man was, no doubt, the spirit or the sprite of that copper kettle that had taken human form, and declares that this was a very sad and pitiable thing. Why exactly the story would have pity on what seems to be a wandering spirit of a piece of bronzeware, I'm not sure. But I'm guessing the idea is that the kettle was sending out its spirit and trying to find a way to relieve itself from the suffering of being forgotten and buried under several feet of earth. But honestly, your guess is as good as mine in this regard, as to what exactly this thing was, why it was doing what it was doing, and why exactly the story refers to its situation as pitiable. And thus is it said that everyone knows that the spirits of objects do indeed occasionally take on human form. And that's the end of these 2 stories about spirits. Now I need to speculate a bit. Like I said before, I had never heard of these creatures, both of which are referred to as tama. At least the first one is. I think the second one is in the title of the story. I don't know, I'll have to double check if that's wrong. I'll let you know in post. But tama means spirit. And yet, when they use the term spirit in this instance, they don't use the regular kanji character, which is this tama, like in tamashi, right? They use the character, this one, which is one of the characters used to write the modern word for sprite, yosei. Although from reading these, it's clear that the ancient Japanese believed that non-animate objects could, and indeed did, have spirits in a similar manner to living things, and these spirits could take on various forms. But the ones most likely to get the attention of humans were human forms. They're also clearly physical to some degree and able to be caught and tied up, and also able to change form like the water sprite turning into water in the first story. So what exactly are these things? I don't know. What word should we use to refer them? Tama? Mononoke? Maybe even ayakashi or yokai? What's the difference between all of these words and the words that we use in English that we could translate generally as ghost or spirit, and what English words would best fit them? I also don't know. Let me know in the comments. What I actually like about these stories, though, is that given how old they are, the Japanese hadn't yet had centuries to really pin down these concepts and definitions, so we are left to kind of let our imaginations fill in the gaps. And while some may not like that and would prefer things were a little bit more concrete and well-defined, I find that it adds a little bit of mystery and intrigue to everything, which just makes it a little more amusing in my personal opinion. But that is actually going to be where I end the story, and I end my own little commentary and random ravings on this subject. So if you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to like the video. Please, again, subscribe to the channel because there are plenty more stories where this came from. Trust me. And feel free to share with your friends. Please let me know in the comments your own personal thoughts about what you think these things are, why they're called what they're called, what we should use in English terms to best describe them. If you've heard any other stories involving these things, let me know. And please share with your friends and family, people who are interested in Japanese history, Japanese culture, storytelling, scary stories even though these two stories weren't particularly scary, or people who just generally want to have something to throw on in the background while they do their laundry or are stuck in traffic or whatever other boring things that you kind of just can't get away from. And hopefully we will see you next week for a new story that is actually not originally from this collection of stories, but a different one called the Ise Monogatari, and is indeed an actually scary story, and unlike most of the stories, except for the one with the kimono, actually involves people getting hurt. Because up until now, most of the supernatural things that we've seen have been rather harmless. No longer, because we aren't just dealing with spirits and ghosts anymore, but we are going to be moving into the realm of the Heian period Oni. So please look forward to that. But thanks so much, guys. If you've been watching all the way up to the end here, I thank you sincerely. Ito ureshiu koso haberikere. And we'll see you in the next one. Thanks a bunch.